you know, what I love about this movie is you give us so many movies for the price of one. It's like a love story, there's a Cold War thriller, there's a philosophical sci-fi movie, and I'm wondering, where do you even begin writing something like this? What's the starting point for you in the writing process?
Well, I think anybody that was a movie fan at that time, we're talking 30, 40 years ago at this point, could see the DNA in other movies, you know, from Close Encounters to, you know, the Cold War style movies and that sort of thing. So I was being pulled in different directions. And obviously the one that sort of stands above the others is The Day Years Stood Still, right, which was a philosophical, you know, sci-fi film, you know, from the late 50s. That, you know, asked the question, are we worthy if we were to be judged by a higher intelligence? You know, and it was at that time when people, where UFOs were sort of taking the place of angels and demons in a kind of a new science fiction pantheon, you know. And so that film had a big impact on me when I was, you know, a kid, and I kind of wanted to do my own version of that, but set it underwater, because I was fascinated by the underwater world, about robotics, you know, the ROVs, all that sort of thing. And it just all made sense to me at the time. That's all I could say. That's, you know, what any filmmaker could say. You know, it made sense to me at the time.
Well, the whole setting underwater thing is obviously what sets this movie apart. And it's one thing to write that on the page, but as far as I know, there was no real precedent for doing what you did here in terms of shooting this much stuff wet for wet.
Yeah, I went to the guy who, Al Giddings, who had been the underwater DP on The Deep, which was considered kind of the biggest underwater film that had been done before that. And it was minuscule compared to what we tackled on this. And his eyes were pinwheeling half the time, thinking about what we were going to try to do. But he and I found a big tank in Gaffney, South Carolina, that was an uncompleted nuclear power station. And we climbed up on this giant crane in a rainstorm and looked down at this thing, and it just all made sense to us. Okay, we can do the dive dock over there, we can have the viewing window over there so we can see all the tank operations, and we kind of put the whole thing together. So it was based on, you know, what he had done in the past, just sort of 10 times, you know, larger scale.
Well, you know, so often with your movies, whether it's this one or T2 or obviously the Avatar movies, you know, you're often writing these stories that require technology or modes of filmmaking that haven't been invented yet. And I'm curious, do you ever censor yourself, or are you afraid when you're writing this stuff, or do you just take it on faith that you and your team are going to be able to figure out how to execute it?
I think I write myself into a corner, so I have to figure out something cool. I think it's a deep insecurity that you know, I have to pull some rabbit out of a hat every time, you know, to show an audience something new. Probably comes from an insecurity as a writer, as an actor's director, or whatever. That you know, I can't just do that. I have to do some big hat trick, you know. And so, you know, there's some pretty ambitious images in this film. I think some of them were successful. Some of them we can do a whole lot better now with CG and the ability to simulate water and to get scale. You know, the whole thing of the mothership coming up at the end, you know, our imagination definitely exceeded our ability to execute on that, because water doesn't scale, and everything was done with scale miniatures at that time, except for the pseudopod scene and the actual kind of giant wave itself. But you know, every film is a still cross-section of its time, what was possible at that time. Where we pushed it to new ground was with the pseudopod scene, which I think is the most kind of dreamlike and surreal moment in the film. And I think it's the moment that certainly caught people's attention. The film was not a ginormous success in the marketplace, although obviously a lot of people have discovered it as we go along. But that scene made an impact, and it impressed a lot of people. It showed them what was possible in a new way, and I think it sort of kicked in the door to the start of the CG, you know, explosion. It was like the CG Cambrian explosion that took place. The next film out of the gate was Terminator 2, which took that. Obviously it was liquid metal, but it took that idea of a liquid character that could shape change and morph and have base and could speak and all those things. And then we were off to the races at that point.
Well, it's so crazy to me when you say that you have an insecurity in terms of writing and directing actors, because I think, the best shot in this entire movie is Ed Harris with the camera underneath him, basically ordering Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio to come back to life.
He wills her back to life. And there's some, kind of politically incorrect stuff in there. You probably wouldn't even try to do today, But his performance is amazing. And, an unfortunate thing happened right before we shot his close-up, which is on her revival. I got basically 1.5 takes on that. She did it once fine, and she was right at the point of starting to come back to life on the second take, and we had just rolled into it back to back, and I had to give everybody a chance to reload, and one of the cameras flapped out, and I heard we had this thing then called film, you might have heard. I heard the tail end of the roll flapping in the magazine, but I still had another camera going, so I didn't cut, right? And the director of photography, who I think did a spectacular job on the film, except for this one moment, cut in the middle of her performance, and she got up and she stormed out. She kind of, had a big meltdown, and so Ed had to perform it without her there. And he's basically just performing straight to the lens and slapping a sandbag. But he was a trooper, he did it, and he brought his A game, which he did throughout the film. Yeah, they both did. They're both spectacular actors.
Well, he was such a great choice, and at this point in time, he wasn't necessarily thought of as any kind of leading man or anything. Was that any sort of battle for you with the studio? I would assume they would have wanted somebody who was sort of more conventional movie star type.
Yeah, he wasn't thought of as a leading man. You can see he had the male pattern baldness at a very young age. He was very athletic and incredibly handsome. I just thought he was an unusual choice He didn't sort of fit the mold, the typical Hollywood, leading man action character. And the studio said, "Oh, you got to give him a wig." And that's like, I'm not wearing a rug. Forget it. He's not wearing a rug.
Well, I'm curious what the casting process for this movie was like, because you not only have to get great actors, you have to get great actors who are capable of meeting the physical challenges of this. They've got to be able to dive, all this kind of stuff. And so I'm curious how you cast it, and also, did you get anybody who came in who lied to you and said, "Oh yeah, I can do that"?
When you're casting a Western, everybody says they can ride a horse. Find out on the first day of shooting whether they can or not. So everybody went through training. They had to go through basic scuba training, which we did down in Grand Cayman, on a liveaboard dive boat for a week. We got them all scuba certified. I took them in deep submersibles there because they used to operate a sub there. They all went down to almost 1,000 feet, got a feel for what that was. And it turned out and Ed turned out to be an exemplary diver. He actually was on the movie. He couldn't do that trip, so that's where Mary and Michael Bean and everybody else learned to dive. Ed had to get scuba certified, I think, in a quarry in Minnesota or something like that. But he came in. He was a very, very good diver. He didn't love diving, and I don't think he ever went diving again. But he was very good at it. Maybe I'm permanently traumatized. I think I had a year where I didn't even go in the ocean after making this film. But there was one actor, J.C. Quinn, bless his heart, that said, "Oh yeah, sure, I'm great in the water." Deeply claustrophobic, and Joseph was absolutely dreading. He had one day that he had to shoot underwater. He was dreading and dreading and dreading. And finally I said, "JC, you're just going to have to suck it up. We got to go do this. You're going to be fine." And this was after I had run out of air and my helmet almost died, and stuff like that. So I don't know how convincing I was. But anyway, he was over the moon when he came out of the water. He felt like he had climbed Mount Everest, And it's a nothing scene. It's just he's outside welding on the wellhead, and they're just bitching and moaning about the work. That was a big scene. I kept him out of all the stuff where they go inside the sub. The stuff that was actually legitimately scary, and you had to have your ship wired pretty tight to be able to do that. As actors in helmets going in to an overhead scenario. Of course, we always had what we called the angels, who were the safety divers, who were right there, and each one was assigned to one or two actors and just kept them in sight the whole time. So, we never had any safety incidents, fortunately.
Okay, I want to go back to what you said, which is that you ran out of air and almost died at one point. So,
Yeah, that. Well, the safety divers were watching the actors. We're watching me. But yeah, no, it was a close one because we were working 30 feet down, and for me to be able to move the camera around and everything on the bottom, I wore heavy weights around my feet, no fins, heavy weight belt around my waist. And when the regulator, like anybody here diver, put your hand if you're a scuba diver. Okay, so we got quite a few here. So you know, when you get down and the tank gets low, you get a few hard draws. You got a little bit of a warning that you're about to run out of air. Well, this thing had a piston servo regulator in it, and it was one breath and then nothing, nothing. And I'm in a helmet, heavily weighted, standing on the bottom at 33 feet. Right, in the dark, and everybody's setting lights and doing stuff. Mary Elizabeth is watching me, and I'm trying to get Al Giddings' attention on the PA. But Al Giddings had been involved in a diving accident on the Andrea Doria, where he was rescuing a guy. This is like typical of an Al Giddings story. He was rescuing a guy, and the bell was moving up and down in the storm, and he blew out both eardrums. And the guy was deaf as a post. So I'm using my last breath of air on the underwater PA system going, out, I'm out. He's working away with his back to me, and I'm like, out. So I had to bail out all my gear, get all my gear off, and I'm wearing heavy weights. I can't swim up, and I can't get the weights off because you can't see anything once you take the helmet off. So I'm kicking, to the surface, and the safety diver gets to be about 10 feet from the surface, sticks a regulator in my mouth that he didn't check. And it had been banging around on the bottom of the tank for 3 weeks and had a big rip through the center of the diaphragm. So I purged carefully, took a deep breath of water. And then I purged it again, and I took another deep breath of water, and at that point, it was almost checkout time. And the safety divers are trained to hold you down so you don't embolize and let your lungs overexpand going up if you're holding your breath. But I knew how to, what they call blow and go, free ascent. I knew what I was doing. And he wouldn't let me go. And I had no way to tell him that his regulator wasn't working. So I punched him in the face and tried to get him. And therefore survived.
So, you mentioned this PA system. You're I'm fascinated. The whole time I was watching this movie tonight, I was thinking, how on earth are you communicating with the actors and your crew when you're all underwater?
Well, I got to talk to them and nobody got to talk back. No, there was only one PA system, and everybody was hardwired. So the actors were hardwired so we could record their dialogue. If they wanted to talk to each other, they had a way, when the camera wasn't rolling, of touching their helmets together so that they could pull through their face plates and talk to each other. But they're just killing time, while we were moving lights or whatever. But yeah, I had a big PA system, kind of voice of God in the dark. And the tank was bigger than this room, you can imagine. And we didn't have a lot of really advanced lighting at the time. We managed to get it lit up, but it was always pretty dark. And so it was kind of spooky, but it was fun. I mean, I thrive on that stuff. And all the people who were really hardcore divers had never seen anything like it and were loving it. A really good friend of mine became a friend afterwards. Charlie Arneson did all of Ed Harris's doubling when he was diving down the wall and falling down the wall in that water suit. Of course, there was no air. So Charlie was doing essentially a 60-foot free dive in a flooded helmet with a nose clip. And if he missed an equalization, there was no way he could stop. He was just going like a rock. And he hit the bottom like Wile E. Coyote and it was hysterical every time. Boom. And so, there was kind of some serious stunt work. I didn't watch the whole film tonight, but I did come in kind of toward the end where he had this confrontation with the NTIs. I was kind of surprised at kind of how relevant it still is in terms of the nuclear threat and stuff like that. I wanted to do like the ultimate name drop. I was literally talking for a documentary film project to Bill Gates today. We were talking about AI, right? And he said, yeah, we got to do something about the whole war thing. Yeah, we really got to do something about the war.
Yeah, no, it's amazingly prescient movies that age so well. Mentioning that thing with the Harris character going on Broadway, that was another thing watching tonight. I was trying to figure out how on earth you did it. The stuff with Ed Harris having the oxygenated liquid, and I want to know how you did it with the rat.
Okay, so the rat, that was a remarkable piece of acting. No, actually, the rat had no choice. He was going to breathe liquid. And I went to the guy who was the leading researcher in the world who was doing this liquid ventilation stuff. And they were trying to perfect the technique so that they could help preemie babies survive, and there were other things. And they were looking at it possibly for deep diving. And he actually showed me how to do it with a rat and to do it safely. And we did it with 5 rats, and they were all fine. And Ed watched the rat and said, I got to do that. Now, he knew he wasn't literally going to be taking, oxygenated fluorocarbon into his lungs, but he had to simulate it, so he had to be pretending to breathe while holding his breath. So he's holding his breath way in the back of his throat, back here, but moving his diaphragm and opening his mouth, and pretending to be moving that liquid in and out, which takes quite a lot of effort. You can see that the rat was really having to work hard to get the liquid in. And so Ed had this, he used the rat as a guide for his performance, And I thought he sold it pretty well. And he was in a helmet filled with liquid though, the entire time. The difference is when he was above water and they're doing the scene where it fills up and he kind of, thrashes for a bit and he calms down and realizes that it worked. That was an actual helmet that had to hold water, right? So we were really spooked by that. It turned out the way we built it was those two big hoses that came up on either side. We were able to pull those and dump all the water in the helmet through these large openings in like 4 seconds. So if he got into trouble, we could get him to air in 4 seconds. So he considered that to be safe. When he was underwater, I didn't want to be messing around with any of that, so we created a helmet where the entire faceplate would open like a motorcycle helmet. So he'd be breathing away on the scoop regulator, looking at his lines, and he had special soft scleral contact lenses that allowed his eyes to focus in water, which was really cool. I've tried them. I've used them for free diving. It's amazing. You can see perfectly. So he's sitting there going over his lines in a laminated plastic strip, and thinking, breathing on a regulator. We'd get ready to shoot, and he'd pop the regulator up, hold his breath, click that faceplate closed. We made sure that it was really easy to open for him. And so it looked like he was in that same sealed helmet that you saw before, but he wasn't. So we could get him a regulator very, very quickly. But there's a mental discipline involved in doing all this sort of thing that you really got to respect what he managed to accomplish.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm curious, as you describe all of these problems that you guys solved, I'm wondering, what were the sort of unforeseen things for you? Like, what was more difficult about this than you expected?
Well, it was always some damn thing. I mean, we were dealing with 7 million gallons of water, and it had a tendency to sometimes just go cloudy for no apparent reason. We had all these filters and heaters and stuff outside. It was quite a major, it was almost like building a major aquarium facility from scratch, And we didn't build the tank structure, but that's the only thing we didn't bring. We had to bring in all these big heaters and filters and hundreds of miles of piping and all kinds of stuff. And sometimes it would just get murky. You'd come in the morning and it's like, all right, what's the weather in the tank? Sometimes you can see all the way across 210 feet to the other side. Sometimes you can see like 10 feet. Now what do? We do a scene where you only need to see 10 feet. We go inside the sub or we do something like that. You just gotta roll with it. And then the other thing that was fun was we had this big construction crane that stuck up over the top of the tank, which would occasionally get hit by lightning, and we were all in the water. Right? So whenever anybody would see lightning on the horizon, 10 miles away, we all had to get out of the tank and wait until it went through.
It's amazing when you talk about this, because the cinematography in the movie is really consistent and beautiful, actually. And that's another thing I was watching, some of these camera movements are very elegant, but obviously you can't have a dolly, I wouldn't think, in this situation. So what kinds of rigs were you creating to sort of execute this?
We were able to use a crane underwater, just a normal camera crane, not one with a remote head like you have today because the electronics wouldn't hold up, but we could use a camera crane and we could swing it around and the camera operator could just sit up on the crane and just operate. So we were able to do very controlled rises and swings. My brother Mike is a very good engineer. He built a twin rudder DPV, diver propulsion vehicle called the Sea Wasp, and we could use that to fly the camera around. So, and sometimes you just swing the camera. You're completely free in three-dimensional space, which is wonderful. Above water, we use the normal tools, crane and steady cam, typical things for that time. When I look at the visual effects, I think they did some amazing stuff. So, Yateman was in charge of one group of people. They were doing a lot of stuff just in smoke that was dry for wet of the submersibles. We had another team, Walt Conti and Ty Boyce, who built radio-controlled big quarter-scale subs. They weighed about 600 or 700 pounds for the whole sub chase. And most people tell you, well, radio frequencies don't propagate through the water, but they used some kind of low frequency that ran along gantries over the top of the tank to keep proximity to the subs. And they were able to drive the subs around. Every once in a while, the subs would go completely out of control. Those guys using ladders and knock people over. And me operating the camera, I got knocked over a few times by the subs. But it all worked pretty well.
Well, I read something that I wanted you to confirm because I was kind of shocked by this. I read that The Abyss was the first movie to use multiple effects houses. That before that, everybody would just say, "Oh, we're going to ILM," or "We're going to..."
Right. Well, that was a panic move because we got a bid from a big effects house. It wasn't ILM. ILM did work on the film. We got a bid from a very big effects house, and it was like double or triple our budget. And I said, "All right, let's just break this up. We'll break it down into smaller bite-sized pieces," because I thought it was more like a fear factor than a real number. And I think it was right on that because we did manage to do the effects more or less on budget for about half of what that bid was by parting it around to different houses. It's very common now to break up the show and then bring the coordination of the whole effects in-house, which is what I did with John Bruno, and that's the first time I worked with John. He and I are close friends. Got to be friends over that film. He took on some of the big outdoor water work where we see the ship. He went out and they were out offshore off Seattle, I think, someplace like that, shooting in stormy conditions. And we had Fantasy 2, a company doing some of the model work of the Skotak brothers, who I had worked with at Roger Corman, and then I had worked with them again on Aliens. And they came in to do the whole crane crash sequence. So we just broke it up around. And it was my first entree to working with Dennis Muren at ILM. And he was such a superstar, wizard. I mean, he always saw what was possible next, And it was Dennis that assured me that they could do the pseudopod sequence. Because that had never been done. I had actually written it initially that the water flowed over the ground, kind of like a snake. And I thought, let's have it reach in. I thought that'd be cooler. Well, you just see if somebody can do it, And we were right on that early cusp of being able to do CG for film. It was really the first soft surface CG character ever in a movie. And it was actually conventionally optically composited. We weren't even doing digital composites at that point. We did the first digital composite on Terminator 2 a couple of years later, and then the effects company that I founded, Digital Domain, with Stan Winston, then subsequently really broke down the problem of digital composite, and we moved fully into the digital world at that point, but that was a few years later. So we were right on the leading edge of a lot of these techniques that we completely take for granted these days.
Absolutely. And in terms of the editorial process, I'm wondering how challenging that was, because obviously the version we watched tonight is not the theatrical release. And honestly, I like the theatrical release a lot, but I love this version so much. I'm kind of curious why this isn't the one you released at the time.
Well, I wasn't This was my first really big kind of mega budget movie. And, you know, it wasn't kind of a slam dunk in the way Aliens was. Like, we just knew Aliens worked, right? So we didn't know exactly how it was going to work. We went out and tested it, and I was unfamiliar with the testing process. I had never done it before. We didn't test the Terminator, and we didn't test Aliens. I never had to read cards and get feedback from a test audience. And in those days, you just go out in the movies someplace and you do a test audience, and it never kind of leaked out. There was no avenue for it to leak out. The first major leaks came on Titanic with Ain't It Cool News, you know, Harry Knowles, and that's the first time they started, you know, leaking information from test screenings. You know, it was a big thing. But this was still where you thought you could sort of go out someplace and have like a little laboratory and get some market research. And I didn't know how to read the cards. I didn't know how to interpret the data. The studio wasn't terribly helpful, I have to say. We went out and we actually screened it twice. Once with the wave sequence in and once with it out. Because the wave sequence wasn't done. It was just a bunch of storyboards. And you can't ask a non-professional cinema audience to watch a movie where all of a sudden it just comes to drawings. They don't know how to process it. So, you know, of course the cards were bad for the wave sequence and the cards were bad for the non-wave sequence. So we kind of went, well, at least it's shorter without the wave. At least it doesn't cost as much to finish. You know, but so I didn't really know how to interpret the data, and I think we overreacted. And I've learned as a result of that how to interpret those cards and what they really mean, and when to take it seriously, and when to just assume the movie's not done yet, they're not getting the full picture. So a couple of years later, I think it was in '92, we decided to just go ahead and finish the unfinished visual effect and put it all together and see what it looked like. And I think, you know, I agree with you. I think it's a better movie. It's the film I intended to make, if nothing else. But I actually think that you see how a lot of the themes do come together and how it truly is a kind of a proper, you know, heir apparent to the day that you're still, which was what my intention was. And I came in, I was at the back of the house just for that last section, and when it gets to that, there's that little clip that they run, which is like all the bad things humans ever did in whatever it is, 45 seconds. We called it Atrocity's Greatest Hits. It was cut by a young guy named Ed Marsh, he was literally just working in the sound and AV department. You know, I think he was running the monitor screens on set. But, you know, he had a flair as an editor, he cut that sequence together. And I mean, it stands today as a remarkable piece of editing, I think, you know, and it gives me chills every time.
I think we have time for a few audience questions, if anybody has any. Yeah, back there. Yeah.
I was wondering if you learned from me and how you kind of go through all of that, how you
I'll repeat the question so everyone can hear it. The question was, what lessons you learned on The Abyss that you was able to apply to Titanic and Avatar?
Well, a wiser man than me would have learned never to mess with water. But I think what I learned was, in a way it was something I already knew, but to have it graphically demonstrated to myself and the crew every single day, which is you have to respect the force of water and the difficulty of working with it. I mean, the water sometimes would come pouring into the set and blow the set apart. You know, when Ed Harris is being rammed down the corridor by that big flood coming in behind it, the set just blew apart. Just blew apart, collapsed, just blew the walls right out of it. You know, they had underestimated the force and the power and the weight of water. So we were prepared when we got to Titanic. We built the sets out of steel. Really no bullshit. We built the sets out of steel. We knew that was the only thing that was going to work. And I think it allowed us to keep people safe on Titanic, which was obviously, you know, yet that much more complex and ambitious. We had a lot more people in the water. We had hundreds of people in the water on Titanic. We had to keep them all safe. And when water starts moving, you can't stop it, you can't swim against it, you can't resist it. So, you know, respect for water, respect for the difficulty of the process. You know, learned a lot about underwater lighting and putting cameras in water and how you coordinate water teams with divers in the water and people working above the water, that sort of thing. Yeah, it was a good primer to cut my teeth on before I got to Titanic, and then of course you learn from that, and then Titanic was a good primer for doing The Way of Water, where we were still working underwater. We weren't doing photography, we were doing performance capture. But before we went into that tank with the actors and the stunt people for The Way of Water, we went out to the Bahamas with working mock-ups of our creatures to figure out how to ride creatures at high speed underwater, on water, diving into water. We actually had a vehicle that was meant to be a skim wing. I know I'm digressing, but these are the things you learn. We actually had a thing you could ride that was like the skim wing in the water that could go 15 knots underwater, come out of the water, fly over the surface at about 15 or 20 knots, and then dive back in. And it took 2 days to figure out how to hold on to that submarine. You know you're not in that picture.
The question was about his use of high frame rate in Avatar 2 and how he plans to use it in the future.
Well, I prefer to talk about the abyss, but seriously, that's why we're all here. I think high frame rate is a way of making 3D better. And obviously at the time I was making the abyss, I wasn't working on 3D. I wasn't even thinking about 3D yet at that point. But it's a way to make, a lot of people have issues with the strobing in 3D, which is made worse. We've all lived with strobing for 120 years of cinema at 24 frames a second, but at 48 and 60 frames a second, the strobing is radically diminished, and it makes the 3D experience better. But if you just use it as a format, like IMAX is a format, 70 millimeters is a format. High frame rate shouldn't be a format. It should be used as an authoring tool where it has value, and not used where it doesn't add value. So that's the quick answer. Yeah. Okay.
So the question was about, that he's got these great ensembles in The Abyss and Aliens, and what the casting and rehearsal process is like, and how you develop that camaraderie among the actors.
Rehearsing for a film is potentially dangerous because you don't want to sort of lock in on performance until you get there on the day. But I use rehearsal as an exploratory process. So to start with first principles, Howard Hewer cast the film, brought in some amazing actors. Went back and forth between LA and New York, found the people that I wanted. They weren't necessarily the people that I visualized, but I go on the individual. I don't go on trying to fit a stereotype of a character that I've created in my mind. I think I managed to find everybody that I needed that were spectacular. I remember battling with the studio a little bit about Ed and Mary, because they're a little bit off-center, and they saw this as their big action movie for the summer and all that crap. But once I fought those battles and got them together, now we had to create a team in the same way that we had a team in Aliens. I hadn't experienced that before Aliens. Terminator was just really a three-character play, and they're very isolated from everybody around them. But here I had to create a camaraderie. So in Aliens, everybody went through boot camp. They became a squad together, and they went out and they marched and they ran and they crawled through the mud and all that sort of thing. I said, all right, well, I've got to do kind of the same thing here. So it was really the dive training. It was living on that dive boat for a week. It was getting certified together, and then it was coming back to the tank and learning the helmet training, because that was a separate layer. They had another week or I think 4 or 5 days of helmet training. And I remember them dancing and doing flips and doing conga lines and all sorts of things together. They really enjoyed the process of learning and learning to be with each other underwater, because they're supposed to be professionals. By the time you get to them, there are no newbies in the whole thing. Everybody's supposed to be pretty pre-seasoned, so our actors had to be able to sell that. So they had to get past survival to actually acting it, sort of from fear to performance. And so we made sure that we sort of got that out of the way early, and we did a lot of the dive work up front so that they could stay in a continuum of that. And then all the above water stuff was done second. So they went straight from very intensive dive training, which was a bonding experience, into the shooting of the underwater stuff. They actually had to act to create the animosity because the SEAL team and the riggers all sort of bonded with each other, so they had to remember to act like they didn't like each other. They were suspicious and all that. But that's part of it. I mean, I wouldn't say it all went well. There were a lot of small problems, but we never had an actor freaking out. We never had somebody who came to me and said, "I just can't do this." It wasn't like that. They really leaned into it. I think I don't want to say they enjoyed the process of shooting the scenes, because some of the scenes are quite grim underwater, but I think they enjoyed the afterglow of having accomplished something that was difficult and that they knew was hard and that they knew had never been done before. I mean, we recorded the first dialogue that had ever been done in a dramatic scene underwater, and we did a bunch of them. We did it every single day. There's a funny thing where we couldn't figure out how to slate. The only microphones that were underwater were inside the helmets. So the way we slated the shot was to bang on the top of the helmet. So I still remember Michael Bean or Neil Burmester or whoever, and the slate was everything. Action! So you know what I'm talking about, yeah.
Well, we're getting signal it's time to wind down.
Let's do one more.
Okay, sure. You pick. Who's got a good one?
Let's do one round.
Great question. We're all wondering, when is the 4K of the Abyss coming out?
Completed the transfer and all the mastering's done, and I think it drops pretty soon, in a couple months, something like that. So it's out of my hands at this point. There's a lot of added material that they're sticking in with, what you know, and then it'll be available, I think, simultaneously on the street and all that. But I wanted to do it right. I didn't want to just say, hey, just go look at the old transfer, at the old HD transfer. I wanted to do it right, and I kind of had a day job getting Avatar 2 finished.
Well, I think I speak for everybody here when I say this was really one of the great movie-going experiences.